has sounded in Sturgis. A fire alarm has sounded in Sturgis. Oh, wait, I'm so old that I first heard that message on KDSJ, the street a little ways. This morning, we're delighted to have Dean Kinney and all of the crew from KBHB here to talk about the heritage of the station, Sturgis's real one and only radio station that does all kinds of things for the community and the greater region here. So I'm certainly looking forward to listening to what you folks have to say. I see old friends, strangers, people that I haven't seen for a gazillion years here at the front of the room, and so this is going to be a good show. Thank you all for coming. So with that, folks, take it away. And
thank you.
Tell us when the fire alarm's going to sound.
Dave, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Appreciate you having us out. My name is Dean Kinney from KBHB Radio. Before we get started, I want to thank Chris J. He's our engineer in Rapid City and Sturgis and helped us get this thing set up. And my wife Tony, who's out here in the audience somewhere, helped us get set up as well. I'm just really blessed to have with me today this panel of people from the history of KBHB Radio. And what our plan is today is to just sort of do this roundtable style, maybe lob some questions at the group and then let them talk about really whatever they want. I do want to introduce you real fast to everybody. Of course, to my immediate left is my predecessor and mentor, Dana Caldwell, who was with the radio station from before the time the station started back in 1962. Immediately to his left is Chrissy Kuiper. She's been at the radio station and is still there with me today since 1978. And then to Chrissy's left is Ray Ritchie. Super happy that Ray was able to come out and join us on the panel today as well. And then of course, needing no introduction, on the end here is the person probably most closely connected with antics on KBHB, and that is Bob Davis. So I want to thank all these guys for coming out. Our news and programming director, Gary Matthews, is also back here. Rich for sure is here. Rich has been with the radio station since 1988. We have I see Jordan Bolsher back here, my partner Clint Bringle. So there's a ton of people that are here, and I recognize just about everybody in the room, and we appreciate you all coming out here today and spending this hour with us. Bruce Hubbard walked up to me a moment ago and said this reminds him of when the classic rock bands get back together and they have a press conference announcing one last tour. And that is kind of what this maybe looks like. I think we're also recording the program today, and we hope to air it back on KBHB in the coming weeks. We haven't exactly decided when we're going to air it, but we'll be letting everybody know about that. I want to start out a little bit with Dana Caldwell. And Dana, oh, and by the way, I just about forgot. I saw Andy Cleven 1 minute before we went. The son of the founders of KBHB, Andy Cleven, is also here. I didn't even know Andy was going to be here until I walked into the room. Marguerite intended to be here, had to attend a funeral or something in Rapid City today, and couldn't be with us. But Andy, thank you very much for joining us. One of the very first people I ever worked with in radio was Andy, when we used to have to run the religious programs on Sunday mornings, and I remember working with Andy when I very, very first started. Of course, his family is the reason this radio station is still here today. I was saying on the radio this morning that this is going to be when I got to the radio station, the term that was thrown around a lot was TKO. And that stood for a typical Cleveland operation, which meant that there wasn't a lot of planning necessarily went into it, and we were just kind of winging it. So this is a TKO this morning here as well on the radio. But Dana Caldwell, I know you started at the radio station before the station was actually on the air. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the very first time you heard about the station and went to work for the Clevens.
All right. Well. The only reason I ever was at the radio station was because of my old friend Betty Matkins. I was teaching school, teaching English at Deadwood High School, and I had planned on going back the next year, even though year's salary there was $3,950. You could kind of get by if you were careful. But I stopped in to visit Betty one day, and she was running the Ford dealership at that time, and she said, you know, there's a radio station coming to Sturgis. And I said, no, I didn't know that. And I believe she was involved. She was one of the original stockholders, I think. There were a group of local stockholders, Russ Molstead, I recall, and I think Clarence Glover, and I can't remember any of the others, but I think there were several more.
In a minute, I was going to turn it over to Bob Davis. Marguerite gave Bob is kind of a history of KBHB. So we'll go down through that. We'll go down through that next, Dana. But just continue with you.
Okay, so I had worked part-time in a radio station when I was in college. Kind of enjoyed it. I was a DJ, and so I whipped down there, and I thought I could get maybe a part-time job DJing. So Les and Marguerite were both in the building. It was, of course, the old location down the Morel building on the corner there across from the Lutheran Church. And Marguerite was sitting out in the front office, and I can still remember she had on a black blouse, and she looked kind of hoodie to me. I'd never seen a woman wear a black blouse before, I guess, and I was a little put off by that. And then, isn't that dumb? But it's true, and I never forgot that. Then she introduced me to Les. He was back in his back office there, and he wasn't very interested in me as a DJ. But he said, "What are you doing this summer?" Well, I was doing some sales work for the Fremont family from Bellefouche, who had a project going on, and he said, "Well, are you selling any of that stuff?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I am." And he said, "Well, I need a salesman." He said, and then he threw out he said he could probably guarantee me $8,000 the first year, plus some commission. And I thought, oh, that's kind of a no-brainer then. So I signed on and started selling right away. We were selling ads 3 months before we went on the air, and sometimes it was hard to convince people there really was going to be a radio station. And then I'll never forget, I got to mention this. We had an old boy who was the secretary of the Chamber of Commerce, a one-man chamber at that time, and his name was Ed Cruikshank. And Les stopped in to talk to him one day. He said, "What do you think about radio stations in Sturgis?" He said, "Oh, it'll never work." He said, I sure wouldn't advise it. Les never forgot that.
I'm going to come back to Dana here in just a minute. Of course, a lot of what we want to chat with Bob about is his time with the station from the late 60s into the 70s. But first, before we do that, Bob, I know that Marguerite has given you kind of a history background on the station. Maybe you could just walk us through a little bit of that next.
All right, Dean, thanks. Marguerite was really sorry she couldn't be here, but she's always got the good information, and she dropped off this booklet from the West River History Conference from 1996. And I looked at it yesterday, and then this morning I made some copies. So I'm not quite, it's 5 pages long, and the copies aren't that good because it was a little bit more difficult to scan. But the essence of this thing is that you can pretty much thank Betty Matkins for the fact that there was ever a radio station in Sturgis. And these pages go through the effort that she and a group of Sturgis people put into forming this radio station. They were Joe Egger, Russ Molstead, Clarence Glover, and Betty Matkins. They sold $100,000 worth of stock to get something going, and then applied for a license and was denied. Then Les Cleveland came along in about 1960, and Les and Marguerite became a part of their group. They filed another application, began reselling the stock again, and the first office was apparently in the basement of the Matkins house, because the FCC said you had to have an office someplace if you were going to have a radio station. So officially the first office was in the basement of Betty Matkins' house. In June 1962, the Clevelands bought controlling interest in the venture. The first officers were Les Cleveland, president, Dave Marsh, vice president, Russ Molstead, secretary, and Marguerite Cleveland, treasurer. The building permit was obtained on June 15th that year. And it goes on to exactly what Dana was just talking about, being the first employee and going to work at the radio station. Their first broadcast was September 27th, 1962. It talks about that. In the first year of operation, their employees were Dana Caldwell, Ray Ritchie, Jerry McGovern, and Craig Finley, who was a high school student and interned. His father was a mechanic at Matkins Ford. Also, Mary Werlinger. I mean, we remember Mary, don't we? She was the custodian, and she's listed here. Then it goes on to...
She left out one important guy, Bob, that's Gene Walters. He was on the original staff.
Well, I don't know if you understand, Dana, but I didn't write this. I'm just supporting what I'm saying.
See, I thought that was your pen.
So it goes on to talk about how the power was increased and so on and so forth, and it's really kind of interesting. If there were not enough, I guess there were enough copies, so that's good. And that's what I can tell you from Marguerite's history report here.
Well, very good. Hopefully everybody that one is able to get a copy of that. I next wanted to introduce Ray Ritchie. Of course, many of you in the room know and remember Ray, who beyond his years at KBHB has done many other very interesting things, including operating one of maybe the very first commercial radio station in Russia. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, or right at the time the Soviet Union was collapsing, so maybe we can come back to that at some point. But before we do that, though Dave Super tipped us off about this a while ago, I haven't done a very good job of organizing this, to say the least. And about 2 weeks ago, after my wife had prodded me for a while, I finally sent an email to Ray and said, I know there's probably no chance you could come at this point, but if you could send some email memories to me, I would sure like to share them. And Ray got back to me within a day and said he would be here. So Ray lives in Bemidji and came out to join us today, and I really appreciate it. And Ray, you were here at the beginning, so talk a little bit about some of your early memories in the very beginning of KBHB.
I came in I think it was very, very early '64, and I had been in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the guy that I worked for, his checks were bouncing, and one morning I would go to the radio station at 4 o'clock, and it was always dark, and I had to go in, turn the lights on, get the news machine, turn the transmitter. This one morning I walked in, and the guy standing in the doorway with a .30-30 rifle. And I looked at him and I said, Charlie, what's wrong? He said, I don't need you anymore. And I thought, am I going to die right here now? I said, okay, that's fine. Why do you have the rifle? He said, you're really big. I said, Charlie, when can I pick up my last check? Here it is. And he would bring us our paychecks, and we had to sign them in the back. And he had some guy, a grocery store guy, that would cash the checks. He'd bring us all the money back, but if we just went to the bank, they wouldn't accept his checks. Anyhow, I went back to my apartment called Brown Institute that I graduated from, because if you weren't an alcoholic or a drunk or using drugs, they give you lifetime placement. I called him and I said, if this was what this radio business is all about, you know, count me out, just take me off the list. I just got met with a guy with a loaded 30-30. Sit tight. They called me back that afternoon and said, do you know where Sturgis, South Dakota is? I said, I've heard of it, I've never been there. They told me how to get there from Cheyenne. They said, there's a guy named Cleveland and he needs an announcer and an engineer. He said, job's waiting. So I loaded my stuff in the car and I went there. And I got about 5 o'clock, pulled up in front of the station, walked in. Marguerite was sitting in the front and she said, are you Ray Ritchie? And I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, they're waiting for you. And I walked into the back office. Cleveland is sitting back in his chair, leaning back with his trademark Lefendrich cigar and his feet up on the desk. Caldwell is sitting on the other side with his feet up on the desk. Fine deal I got myself into. Cleveland said, are you Ritchie? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, what's the matter? I said, well, I got a sinus infection and I just drove over the mountain or whatever. I said, and I don't feel well. He said, well, you got to get well because we got a remote to do tomorrow morning in Spearfish. And he opens his drawer and he pulls out a pill bottle. And he says, here, take this. And I said, my mother told me I shouldn't take it. He said, just take it. And I got you a room down the street at the Travelers, wasn't it the Travelers Hotel? Sweet little old lady. He said, just go down there, you're all set up. Be here at 7 o'clock in the morning. And, all right. And I just grabbed my stuff and went down there, went inside, and there's this rug, handmade rug, and the floor is linoleum and it's worn out from cleaning, you know. And I stepped on the rug and I got some clothes in a bag in my other bag, and I started to step off the rug and this voice went, stop right there. And I looked around and there's this lady about this tall. Take off your shoes? And I said, well, take them off. I took off my shoes. Sign your name here. She took me up the steps. Got me in a room. We had to share the bathroom at the end of the hall. Half hour later, there's a knock on the door and she said, Raymond, are you decent? I said, well, yes, ma'am. And she opens the door and she has a cup of warm milk with honey and butter. And she says, this will make you better. Now I want you to drink this and then go to sleep. And I said, okay, and I'm thinking, yeah, well, I gotta take this pill first. So I did. I took them, went to bed, woke up the next morning feeling absolutely great. Got to the radio station, Cleveland got me in the car and we headed for Spearfish. We pulled up to where we were gonna do the remote. And I remember he had a 2-wheel trailer, camper. And he set it up so that if you sat in the front, you were okay sitting on the cushion. But if you started to walk to the back, the trailer tilted. And I started to walk, I think he said, go get me that. And I 2 steps and the trailer goes down and everything. And he said, it'll be all right. And about that time, some little kid walks up and goes, we found the treasure, because he had hidden a treasure, you know, and we hadn't even started the proposal. And I looked at Cleveland and he just had this look on his face like, I'm gonna kill that little kid. Cleveland says, okay, be back here at noon and we'll get you your stuff. Okay, and the kid takes off and I looked at him like, are we done? Is it done? No, I'll hide another one, just start talking. And I remember at noon he took me to the Kelly Inn in Spearfish. They had great rolls. And I'll never forget this. He took a roll, opened it up, put butter on it. I did the same thing and I tasted the roll and it was absolutely wonderful. Homemade roll. And he's putting salt on it. And I looked at it, I said, the rolls don't need salt. He said, I know, but my mother always used to make the same kind of rolls and she always put in too much salt. So it reminds me of home. That was my very first day at KBHB.
Thank you, Ray. We'll come back to your course here in just a minute. I think we actually have a photograph of that camper that Ray referenced, and maybe it's in some of this stuff over here. We also have here with us today the very first log. We call it a broadcast log. It has all the commercials on it and things like that. At that time, handwritten. And the very first log for the very first day and the first several days of the station is up here as well. Dana, you referenced Gene Walter a moment ago, who, it's my understanding, is the first person to actually speak on the air. Is that right? Or at least that's his contention, I think.
can't verify that, I don't remember. I'm sorry. It was probably either Jim or Gene or Les, I'm guessing, yeah.
What are some of your, do you remember does the day stand out to you in any particular way of the very first broadcast day?
Well, yeah, somewhat. Les and I were in Rapid City having coffee, I guess, at a restaurant down there, and we got a call that we got the license and we could crank up the transmitter, and so we drove to Sturgis about 90 miles an hour and got there and cranked it up and turned the transmitter on, and I don't remember who sat down behind the mic, but it would have to have been one of those two, because some of the others you mentioned weren't quite there at that point in time. I was the only other one, and I worked board shifts pretty regular at that time too. But that was an exciting day.
And Chris, you came to the radio station in 1978. Tell us about your very beginning at the station. Chris is, by the way, today our senior account executive at the Home Slice Group and for KBHB Radio. Chris?
Well, I was hired by Dana, and so I came out. I was actually had just completed my student teaching. I was a teacher too, and just about to embark on a teaching career, which I had a little bit of reluctance about, and I was informed that there was a job opening out at KBHB, and at that time I actually didn't even know where the studio was, even though I grew up around here. Kind of hard to believe. So I went out and interviewed with Dana. I believe at that time that Les was in the state legislature, and so he was not around, and I went out and interviewed with Dana, and then...
What do you remember about that interview?
About the interview, I just remember being a little bit intimidated by Dana. He was sort of an intimidating guy back then.
And for quite a while after that.
And I just remember thinking that I probably could have done a better interview, and I remember which office was his. It was that very back one behind the front desk, and there was an office behind there. Les's was back in the right-hand corner, and Dana's was behind the front desk. And I left there thinking, well, I wonder if I'll get that job. And a couple of days went by, and then I finally get a phone call that I was hired. And so I went out there, and I was hired on as a copywriter. Oh, and I do remember something about my job interview. As a copywriter, and I did have a degree in English. I thought I should be able to do this. Dana gave me something, I think it was from Chase's department store, like a newspaper clipping, and said, here, go write a radio ad with this, and pointed me to a typewriter. And, you know, if you remember what it's like to use a typewriter and not a computer, you know, if you make mistakes, you have whiteout, and you have all this mess to deal with, and I'm trying not to make any mistakes, and I'm typing this ad, and I got done, and I think he gave me another one, so I wrote a couple of ads and handed it back to you, and you looked at them and thought they looked pretty okay. But there again, I waited a couple of days, finally got a phone call that I was hired, and came out and started as a copywriter, which radio stations don't really have now, but at that time, there was a person appointed to write all the radio ads for all the salespeople. And so they would hand me the information, give me some instructions, and say, here you go. And so that was my job as I was hired back on March 1st of 1978.
I got a little bit, thank you, Chrissy. I got a little bit out of chronological order in that Bob Davis, I think, came to the station in 68 or 9. But Bob, talk about your arrival at KBHB.
All right, Dean, I guess my little story starts on the day that KBHB signed on the air in September 1962. I was 10 years old, and I lived about 4 blocks away from the radio station. And I was standing there with my nose pressed up against the glass, looking into that control room and seeing what looked to me like about the greatest production I'd ever seen in my life. It looked like Mission Control or a space launch or something. And all the knobs and tubes and recorders, microphones and things like that, I just thought that was fabulous. So then fast forward to about 1969, Les Cleveland was very good friends with my dad, who was a barber, on the corner downtown, Davis Barber Shop. And Les would stop at the post office and get his mail every morning, and then stop at the barber shop where my dad and probably my grandfather and everybody else in the barber shop would critique Les's program that morning. And if a person had a recording of some of those conversations between the people in that barber shop and Les, you know, that would be worth something. But one day, I was in the barber shop and Les was in there and my dad was in there, and my dad mentioned to Les, he said, you wouldn't have any part-time openings this summer for a girl, would you? My older sister was looking for a job that summer. I was gainfully employed at the Big Bear Drive-In. And Les said, of course that was in the days before women were allowed in broadcasting. No such thing as a women radio announcers. Les said, no, we don't need any girls, but we're looking for somebody to work Sunday mornings on the air. And I guess I piped up and said I could probably, you know, I could do that. And so Les said, well, meet me out there at 6 o'clock Sunday morning. So that Sunday morning I went out and Les gave me about five minutes of instructions. And then he put a pith helmet on and went out on his riding lawnmower. He was trying to start a Christmas tree farm up there where the radio station was. And so he was going out to tend to his Christmas tree farm, and he let me loose that Sunday morning. And the sight of him driving around with out there in the prairie with that pith helmet on, I can remember it just like it was yesterday. So about a week or two went by, and all of a sudden they had an opening in the afternoons for a radio announcer, and I was offered that position, probably temporarily until they could find a real radio announcer, but it worked out pretty well. And I can tell you that I lived and breathed that job for sometimes I lecture my own employees, but for the first 2 years I worked at the radio station, I worked there 7 days a week without a single day off, and I probably would have worked there the whole 10 years without a day off if somebody hadn't forced me to take a day off. So that I really was in hog heaven when I was a kid working out there at that radio station. So that was my beginning. After school got out every day, I went out and worked on the radio. We did a request program, and pretty soon I was on in the mornings. Even I took a break for a year or two and went to work for a TV station in Rapid City. But even while I did that, I worked weekends and holidays at the radio station. And it was a wonderful experience. My biggest achievement out there was getting fired 6 times in 10 years. That's what I was known for.
We're gonna come back to some of those incidents here in a minute. I know one thing that's going to happen for sure. This is one reason I knew we didn't have to do a lot of planning. You get these radio people together, and it's not hard to fill an hour. Ray, talk about some of your on-air experiences and early experiences after you got to KBHB.
Cleveland used to do the sign-on shift, and I would come in at 8. And compared to what the disc jockeys do nowadays, we would talk 8 hours a day, every single day. You got an hour off for lunch, and you didn't get 61 minutes off. You got an hour off, and Cleveland was there going, come on, where you been? And you talked for 8 hours. But when I would come in at 8 in the morning, Cleveland would just be done with his morning show, and then he would do a talk show. And he would have me there, not as a smart guest to help him. I was the boy that he played everything off of. And he sat me in the back studio where he controlled my mic. And he would always put me in situations where I just had to go along with the flow and try to save myself. And finally one day he got me in a position again, and he was talking about, it was deer hunting season, and he was talking about hunting deer out on the Mackey Ranch up by Bison. And we're going out with the Mackeys, and by God, those are good fellows out there and a good family and has great country, and he's just waxing eloquent about his ability to hunt deer, and I'm sure he wore the pip. He's rolling along, and finally he took a break, and I said, "Did you know that Lyndon Johnson is not going deer hunting this year?" And he looked at me and he said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Lee Harvey Oswald won't give him his rifle." Those telephone lines lit up. David said, "We'll be right back." Walked to the back room, chewed my butt out, and said, "You have got a week's vacation right now. Don't touch those phones and get the hell out of here." And so I had a 4 weeks vacation. But it stopped him from putting me in a corner again.
Chris, one of the things I know you did on the air, as politically incorrect as it sounds now, there used to be a program on KBHB called Something for the Girls.
Right.
And Marguerite did that program, and sometimes you hosted that program as well, right?
Right, and I think at the point that Marguerite turned it over to me, she was running for the school board in Sturgis, and it was kind of an ethical issue for her to be on the air during that time, and so she said, "I think it's a good time to turn this program over to you." And we did get information off the wire service every day that was geared towards the female listeners, which kind of is amusing now when I think about it. But yes, I did Something for the Girls at, I think, about 11:15 every day for several years after that.
Dana, talk about the origins of the KBHB radio auction and what you remember about that.
Well, it began with a real live auction. We would go all over the Black Hills and collect merchandise from various businesses that wanted to participate, and we would actually bring it to the radio station, which turned out to be a big job, because we're talking about
Sofas and tractors and all kinds of heavy stuff, plus the little things. And we would then have this humongous auction, and we set up a big Army general purpose tent that we borrowed from, I presume, the National Guard, and we had served a free barbecue. I think just the first day, and we would get literally thousands of people coming there, and the auction got so big that we expanded it to 3 full days of auctioneering, and some of that time we'd actually have 2 rings operating. Francis Haley was always our main auctioneer, and of course anyone that knows Francis knows that was fun to be around Francis, you know. And then it just got to be too big, so we decided to try it on the radio without bringing the merchandise in, and worked pretty good right from the get-go. And so we started after about 3 years. 1 year, remember, Ray, the meat all burned up. We would bury the meat in the pit and then cover it over and leave it there all night. And the wind came up and caught fire, and we had no meat in the morning. So we had to run out to the cheese factory and took hamburger out there, and they hit it with steam, as I recall, and it turned out just fine. But there was always a lot of unexpected things with that radio auction, you bet.
Dana, I also know part of the heritage of the radio station is the editorial content and editorializing on the air, and Les Cleven's version was long called The Reliable Rumor. Maybe you could talk about that for a second.
Well, he almost daily he had a reliable rumor, it seemed like, and it could be anything, politics or city government, in the early days, he hated the Chamber of Commerce and made fun of them actually about every day, and I used to just pull my hair out. I gotta sell ads downtown, and here you are calling the Chamber of Commerce a bunch of clowns, you know? And we finally got past that, and so.
So you were often paying the price for
Yeah.
Cleveland's editorials?
Sometimes, but they were good. I mean, it was, there aren't many radio stations that had the backbone to editorialize. And actually, we continued that policy, I think, right up until today. I know after the last step down, I continued to mouth off whenever something caught my eye, and I think it's good.
Dean?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that should always be remembered about KBHB and about Les and Dana and everybody, about that editorial stance. You know, I see Leroy Shecker sitting in here. At one point, when the cattle industry was in dire needs, there was no money, and meat was being controlled by the mafia in the big cities, and the National Cattlemen's Association wasn't doing anything. These guys all got together up around Bison and here and Faith and everywhere and got with Cleveland, and they had a meeting, and they came up with the meat promoters of South Dakota. I took a 6-month leave of absence and went sale barn to sale barn selling $35 memberships. I got to keep 15 for my salary and gas. 20 went to that group. That ultimately put 27 head of feeder steers on the mall in front of the Secretary of Agriculture. We were covered by Paul Harvey. But it's all because of Les Cleveland raising heck with the cattle industry, going, you know, you better do something. So that, and I mean, there's a number of other things that KBHB had the intestinal fortitude to open that microphone and tell it like it is. That has always made Sturgis, but that radio station. And speaking of the auction, when Dana and Les started it and moved it onto the air, that was later adopted by the National Association of Broadcasters and the RAB. And you go onto the Radio Association of Broadcasters or Radio Advertising Bureau and bring up auction, and it's all detailed on exactly how to do it, which is the way they laid it out. And there's radio stations all across the country doing the KBHB radio auction.
I might add, it was copied by virtually every radio station within our coverage area, and none of them seemed to know quite how to do it, and so they all kind of quit, except for one up here in the Northern Hills, which continues to do a rather unique auction.
Bob, do you remember what you were thinking when you decided that making Bear Beauty Rupt would be good radio?
I do kind of remember what I as a matter of fact. I had kind of it couldn't be called a philosophy, but it was just, and it wasn't even conscious, but it was something in the back of my mind that when I was working at the radio station, I wanted to do something every day. I tried to do something every day that was a little crazy, that people would, you know, if they were driving along, they would turn to whoever's sitting in the car and say, did I hear what I think I just heard? Is that right? Or, you know, something along those lines. And it wasn't a big production to come up with those things. Sometimes it was just a little comment that I would make, but that I thought of while I was at work. But I tried to give the town something to talk about a little bit, pretty much every day. And so that's a little bit where that originated from. I have had a lot of people over the years ask me, you know, they mention War of the Worlds, and of course that's on a different scale, but really, I think the inspiration for that came from something that happened on a peer radio station. and it was KGFX, and the radio announcer's name was the Rebel. I don't know if any of you guys remember the
Yep.
Rebel.
Yep.
He eventually went to KFYR in Bismarck, where I listened to him for years. And I didn't hear this on the radio in Pierre, but I heard about it. And probably the version of it I heard was had been exaggerated and improved upon. But what the Rebel did one year in Pierre was a couple of days before Christmas, he decided to have a Christmas parade. And so he got the sound effects all together and got the thing all organized. There wasn't actually a parade, he was just announcing that there was a parade. And it was a cold, bitter cold day in Pierre that day, a couple of days before Christmas, but people just did not want to miss the annual Christmas Day parade. And so he got hundreds, possibly thousands of people downtown to see these internationally recognized marching bands and things like that. So I think that was a little bit the inspiration for the Bear Butte thing. One of the other employees at the radio station that needs some credit on that was Pat Ockham, who was a young radio announcer at the time. We were having fun with sound effects, and the whole thing was, I will admit, planned out, and it lasted 1 hour. And the impact of it was far beyond, I mean, people on a daily basis, I still hear about Bear Butte erupting. I can't tell you how many times I get phone calls, people saying there's an unusual cloud over there. You should come out and take a picture of it, Bob. And I eventually decided to ask people if they're willing to pay me to take a picture of this cloud. The answer is no, but that's about it. That's kind of what I know about Bear Butte.
What do you remember about the immediate fallout of deciding
Well,
to do
I
that
got
radio?
You know, one thing I remember is Dana was supposed to read the 7 o'clock news that morning. He came out there and he said, "What in the hell are you doing?" And he said, "I'm just having a little radio drama." And he said, "Well, I'm not going to be a part of it." And he marched out. So I was out there at the radio station. It happened between 6 and 7 a.m. on April 1st, 1976, 41 years ago. So I was out there all by myself, and all the telephone lines were lit up. And, I mean, it was ABC and NBC, and Mutual Broadcasting Network, and the governor's office. We were getting ready to evacuate Meade. That's the way the lava was going to flow. The caretaker at Bear, sound effects were so good, I guess, that the caretaker who actually lived at Bear Butte evacuated his family, got the hell out of there. The county agent, John Klepst, was trying to save his wife, and he got in the car and headed out. He decided to go for higher ground. He was going to go for Meade. And he stopped at the Skelly truck stop, which is out there where Subway and so forth is now, the Holiday Inn Express is now. And he went into the restaurant to warn everybody to run for their lives. I remember hearing that story. Who was the pilot up north?
Cole?
No.
Lindbergh.
I can see him, and I was thinking of his name just this morning. But anyway, there was a good pilot, friend of ours, and a big supporter of the radio station up at Buffalo. And he got in his airplane to fly down to look at the destruction he wanted to see up close. I heard from another gentleman up in Meade, he had a big, he had hundreds of stairs out his back door that went up the hill. You know how the houses are in Meade. And when he heard that on the radio, he started climbing those stairs. He wanted to get a good look. He had a heart attack. but it wasn't a bad heart attack. And then when he was telling me the story, he was laughing. So glad that worked out.
Hospital.
Well, didn't they also cancel some of the shifts at the home state mine? They didn't want to be caught underground.
I don't know. But anyway, that was one of 6 times I got fired. And it always happened the same way, less. 5 of those 6 times, I'm sure I had it coming. This last time might have been debatable, but it was always me doing something not on that scale, but something else that really shouldn't have done. I'd get a note from Pam that says, come see Les when you're off the air at 9. So I'd go see Les, and I mean, you could have recorded this conversation. It happened so many times. Les would always say, well, Davis, this time you've gone too far. I'd look down at my feet and said, Les, I don't know what came over me. Well, I've got to let you go. So I'd go home, and 48 hours later, usually around noon, the phone would ring, and it would be Les, and you'd say, Davis, have you learned your lesson this time? When did you come back? And I always got a raise every time I got
Well, I have to tell about another little step that Bob pulled that I'll never forget. Back, remember, it's in the mid-70s, I guess. The Clevens and myself and a man who shall remain unnamed here went into a partnership, and we were going to build a radio station in Dickinson, North Dakota. And so one morning I'm getting ready to go to work out at KBHB, and we've always had one of the few radio stations I ever knew of that did obituaries on the air. We always did obituaries. And so I was listening to the obituaries, you know, and suddenly Bob does an obituary for our partner who lives in Rapid City. And he was kind of a different guy, I'll be the first to admit that. Maybe wasn't my favorite person either.
He had it coming.
He might have. Bob had a regular official obituary that he read, and he said that apparently he fell into an open manhole late Saturday night, and the funeral services are pending. And I thought, oh my gosh. I was thinking of all the ramifications of having a dead partner. And so I would hurry out to the radio station, and I got there simultaneously with Les. And we were walking in the front door at the same time, and I said, did you hear about so-and-so? And Les says, well, yeah, I did. And I said, do you think he's really dead? And Les said, well, he better be, or Davis is dead. I mean, well, it turned out he was not dead. And I think that was another one of those times.
Well, actually, yeah, I mean, you have got all of the facts correct. The only thing I can add is that he had it coming. I warned him what would happen if he did a certain thing. He did the certain thing, and I made it happen. Dean, I'm not sure, how long are we going here? I actually have to leave at noon. I have a picture at 12:15.
I think noon is is when we're supposed to be.
I want to say one thing, and this reflects on my lifelong friend Les Cleveland, who was a mentor to me and probably almost a father figure. We were eventually business partners, and he was just a wonderful, wonderful person to me. But what I'm going to say, I think speaks to his character and the type of person he was. Later, when I owned my own radio station in California, I found out firsthand what this is like. But for nearly 10 years, I ran the call-in program, What's Your Opinion, people would call in, the talk show in the morning. And I had some opinions, Les had some opinions. Some of my opinions were a little bit designed to stir things up so people would call in. If people weren't calling in, it didn't work that well. But here's what I want to say. Not once in 10 years did Les ever come to me and say, Bob, that's not our opinion. That's not the station's view. Or Bob, don't talk about this anymore. Or don't say this. Not once did he ever give me any guidance on what I should avoid to keep the controversy level low or anything like that. Now, when I owned my own radio station, it didn't work that way. It just drove me crazy when people would go down areas that they shouldn't be going down. But I thought, a person that can own a radio station like that and let his employees, give them basically free reign, I think that says a lot about him.
Thank you. Yeah, let's do some final comments. Ray?
I got told by Les one time that we don't do that. There was a little old lady from Ekalaka, Montana that would call up, and she'd call up about 7:45, and she would say, Raymond, and I'd say, yes, dear, and it's on the talk show. Said, the radio station's not coming in very clear today, I can hardly hear you. And this happened time after time after time, and one morning she caught me in the wrong mood, and I said, and I don't remember her name, but I said, Hilda, let me explain to you how this radio works. I said, this is a 5,000 watt radio station. Yes. I said, the first person gets up and turns their radio on, they get half of those. They get 2,500. Oh, I said, the next person that turns them on gets half of what's left. They get 12 and a quarter. And then that goes all the way to, when did you turn your radio on? She says, oh, about 15 minutes ago. I said, you're probably down to 10 or 12 watts. I'll get up earlier, I said. Finished the talk show, walked out, and that's when Cleveland went, Richie? In fact, the first 5 years at KBHB, I thought my middle name was Dammit. But he said, we don't do it that way. That's what he did with it to me. But I want to conclude by saying, in '92, I built a radio station in Moscow, Russia, and ran it for 3 years. It's a city of 12 million people. It was the first 100,000 watt clear FM classic rock and roll, and it was the first Russian-American joint venture radio station in Moscow, Russia. When we signed it on, I thought, my God, what do we do for promotions? Do we do what they do in New York, in Los Angeles, in Chicago? There's 12 million people. And all of a sudden it hit me, KBHB signed on in a small town. I put a radio station on in Gillette, Wyoming. A radio station on in Iowa. We're going to do the very same thing we did at KBHB, and it worked. And I owe all of that to Les Cleveland and all the crew that were there at KBHB that made it all successful.
Thank you, Ray. Chris, do you have anything?
I just wanted to say that Dana did hire me, so I didn't meet Les for a couple of weeks, probably maybe even a month after I'd come on board. And I remember thinking Les is one of those bigger than life people. He just would sweep into a room and you just kind of command everybody's attention. And the other thing about Les is he wanted everybody who worked in radio to actually be a broadcaster. He didn't want you just to be behind your desk doing your little thing. He wanted you to be on the air. And he never asked your opinion about things. He swept in one day with this pile of papers on my desk and said, okay, we're going to start doing this Chris Kitefer's Tourist Minute this summer. And I'm like, we are? Well, I was kind of flattered, but I'm like, he didn't ask me if I wanted to do it. He just said, you're doing this. And that's how Les was. And Les and Marguerite were wonderful to work for. They cared about family, and it's been a great career for me.
Dana?
Well, it's kind of the same for me. Of course, having been there, I forgot how many decades. We went through a lot of people. You know, they would come and go, and some of them were downright strange. I don't know. Sometimes I wondered where Les found these people. You remember Zeb Turner? The Nashville guitarist?
Yeah.
He really was. And how he wound up here, I don't know. But, you know, we had a lot of great people. And we had, I remember one guy, his first day of work, I think, Ray, I think you and I decided to go over to Weimer's Bakery, which was just across the alley there practically, while the Don Allen Breakfast Club was on, which
Yep.
was about a 45-minute shot, and gave us a little break. And we put this kid on the board, and everything was great. It was his first day of work. We came back, he was gone. He decided that wasn't his cup. But on the other hand, we've had some absolutely great people over the years that I really appreciate and miss. Many of them have departed, like our friend Jerry McGovern, Bob Shevling, a few like that I can think of off the top of my head. We've always had, it seems to me, really, really good people. And I think part of that's due to Les, because he was a good judge of character. And I always thought I was a good judge of character. In fact, Chris, the reason I hired you was I knew your dad. And I believe in genetics. And your dad was a really good broadcaster. And I knew you'd be okay. And I was right. Again.
Well, we run over our time as I thought we might. I want to thank everybody for coming out. Hopefully we'll get a chance to do this again in the future. I too thank, in particular, Dana and Les for my start in the radio business, and it's with great pride that we continue the tradition at KBHB today. I want to thank everybody on this panel for coming and spending the hour with us, and all of you and the other staff from the radio stations that are here as well. So thank you very much.